Hey guys, this week we're going to be working on this vulva case, and it's very similar to last week. We're getting some good repetition in, but there are a couple differences. So first off, I want to say that this is the exact same CT as last week. So what you can do is I still want you to create a new week 6 patient. You're going to import this data set so you get the new target volume in there. But you can also import last week's data set into your new patient, and you can just copy your OARs that you already contoured onto this new data set if you want to save yourself a little bit of time. I'm not going to show you how to do that, but I'm sure you guys can figure that out, or you can just recontour, up to you. But anyways, this week's we're stepping it up a notch, complexity wise, and the reason it's a little more complex is the shape of the PTV is just a little bit different. It breaks up into multiple pieces, and if you notice, it extends outside the body. So we're going for a good skin dose here. Okay, so we're going to be using Bolus. All right. So I already threw a plan on here. I got my 2 arcs. I already played with my collimator angle to see what would produce the smallest total X jaw size, with the arc geometry tool. I just adjusted this number until this number was the smallest. It happened to be about 15 degrees that produced the smallest width, total width in my X jaws. Okay, so 15. And then I already dragged my X1 jaw over on field 1 in order to get it a little bit closer to that 15 cm total width, right? So I drag X1 over, and then field 2, I drag X2 over. But I want to show you something real quick. Let's say, well, let's just put this back for a second. So this is what I'm going to do for my plan. So on field 1, I drug X1 over, shortened X1, right? Field 2, I shortened X2, and again, the point is to get it closer to 15 cm. I don't think you need to go all the way to 15 because, for instance, from this angle, X1 is going to close automatically because we have jaw tracking, right? So usually 16, 17, 18, something in there. Just kind of depends on the shape of your PTV. So what I want to show you real quick, so imagine there's a straight line going straight up and down through your ISO. And let's say this was a little bit steeper, so I'm just going to make it 45 degrees in order to show you this. But right now, imagine a line straight through my ISO up and down. You never want to shrink your jaw past that imaginary line. So basically, if I'm way over here and I draw a line straight down from my ISO, this PTV in this triangle now, this straight line here, imagine there's a triangle here, and then imagine this arc rotating around this ISO. The PTV that is in this triangle here is never gonna get a look from this arc. Makes sense, right? It's just never, this PTV down here in this triangle will never get a look from this arc. And then if you do the same thing from this one, if you also have that triangle down here from this arc, you have a big chunk of PTV down here that will never get a look from either arcs, right? So you got to make sure you don't do that too. So you just kind of draw a line straight up and down, and then you want to make sure your jaw is not past that line. All right. You'll notice right away once you start optimizing because you won't have coverage down there. But just wanted to point that out to you. All right. Field 1, drag X1 down over. Field 2, drag X2 over. Make that a little wider, 16.2. Okay, our prescription is the same, 180 times 28, so 50/40. Now, before we start planning, we need to add our bolus. Okay, so I'm going to insert a new bolus. Whenever I create a bolus, I always put the thickness of the bolus, just so there's no confusion for anyone on how thick it should be. So we're going to make we're going to make a 1 cm bolus, so 10 millimeters. And we're going to do 1 cm because this PTV extends 5 millimeters outside the body. And we're going to pretend like the physician told us he wants good coverage on that PTV. So we can't use a 0.5 cm because that would just put the edge of the bolus right against the edge of the PTV. We wouldn't get good coverage, right? So we need to go to 1 cm. And when you're making a bolus, you use this blue box, right? I know you guys have all made a bolus before, but maybe not for a VMAT plant. So the only difference between making a bolus for VMAT and IMRT versus 3D is usually a lot of times for 3D you're going to just cover your whole field with that bolus. For IMRT or VMAT, I mean, we're treating all the way around the patient with full arcs, right? So anywhere that bolus is at is going to contribute to skin dose, right? And so we don't want to treat healthy skin. We only want this bolus to cover where we need it, right? So we're going to play with this blue box. And these are tricky. These are always tricky because usually they kind of wrap around the leg. Sometimes they go really far posterior, where the patient is, against the back lock. So it can be tricky to kind of figure out how to do these. Really, we just got to do the best we can. And then what I'll show you, one way we can kind of help the therapists place this bolus. And then ultimately they can also use the cone beam to over the first few days kind of adjust that bolus if they need to based on what they're seeing with the cone beam. So inferiorly, it looks like I'm going down far enough. Okay, I don't want to go any lower than that. And then I'm going to just kind of scroll through here. So superiorly, about right here. Then I'm just looking for the furthest extent left and right. About right there, about right there. So let's just make that and see what it looks like. Oh, it's taking forever because I accidentally put 10 cm. All right, I paused it so I could think about that. Took a while since I put 10 cm on accident. Obviously, we don't want to keep that, so I'm going to right-click on my bolus, edit bolus, and we're going to do it again. 1 cm. There we go. All right, then I'm going to just kind of look this over, see if I like it. Now up here where the PTV splits, I don't think it's important to get too fancy here. I don't think it's a problem that we're, connecting our bolus into one, right, and treating this middle part. Down here, though, we got all this extra bolus. So it's really just up to your department and your therapists and doctors what they want to do. Obviously, it's easier to keep this bolus, kind of square and as one big piece. But if you want to, you can use this freehand tool on your bolus and edit it, right? Just like you were contouring. This tool gets a little weird sometimes, so usually if I'm trying to remove, I will use this minus button. If I'm trying to add, I'll use this plus. This automatic tool just sometimes doesn't work so great. So let's say we want to start removing a little bit. Maybe remove that whole slice. Maybe this whole slice. So now we just have one slice kind of below where that PTB starts, and say we want to kick some of this out. But again, the more complicated the shape is of the bolus, obviously the more complicated it will be for the therapist to create this bolus and set it up. So it's always a good idea to kind of talk with them about what's possible. But I do think in most cases it is important that whatever you make in Eclipse, the therapists replicate on the machine. Just because, again, we're treating all the way around the patient, so we're treating through this bolus that we created here, right? So if there's missing bolus in the treatment or extra bolus in the treatment, obviously your dose distribution will be different. So it's kind of a balance between creating the ideal bolus and creating the bolus that's reasonable for them to create. Let's just do a few more here. Something like that. Let's pretend like we're happy with this. One neat trick that you can do in order to help the therapist place and make this bolus is you can insert a new setup field. And if you right click on the setup field and link to the bolus, you can see the bolus right on the skin, which also it's a good indicator I missed a slice down here. Oops. So I'm going to erase that slice too. That looks a little better. Okay, but with this setup field, depending on what your bolus looks like and stuff, you can first find a good angle where you get the best view of your bolus. In this case, this bolus is kind of centered anteriorly, so keeping that gantry at 0 is perfectly fine. But now what we can do is add MLCs to this setup field and then trace the outline of our bolus. Something like that. You can use your jaws too if it's in between your MLCs. So something like that. So you cannot keep a bolus attached to a setup field. You have to remove it. So we just linked it so we could see it. We can draw the outline. Now I can remove that link. But now what they can do on the machine is load up this setup field and use the light field to trace out where the edges of the bolus should be. All right. And you can use multiple fields if the bolus kind of wraps around weird, but it really makes a big difference, makes it much easier in the room to tell where this bolus should be and how to shape it, how to cut it, things like that. Unfortunately, when it does this, kind of wraps around and goes underneath, you can print pictures kind of this axial slice to show them kind of what it should look like. But again, you really just have to kind of guess, and the physician can help, place it where he actually wants it to be on the patient, and then just kind of compare over the first few days to your cone beam in order to kind of finalize that bolus shape. Okay, so we have our bolus. You cannot just create your bolus, you have to also link your bolus to whatever fields you want to be affected by that bolus. So we want this bolus on both fields. So link to both and optimize. Okay, other than that, this is going to be very, very similar to all of our other plans we've done. We have a CTV this week though, so I am going to add a lower on that CTV just so we can make sure we have good control on that dose. So again, I'm starting with just my targets and my NTO, of course, and I just want to see this dose, get fairly conformal. I want good coverage, no hotspots. If any of those things are not happening, I have a problem with my beam arrangement. Obviously, if I don't see dose out here in the bolus, I forgot to link the bolus to the field, so you can go do that. In this case, this volume is pretty wide, so we'll see how it shapes out here. I think it's starting to look fairly good, but maybe a good case to add a third arc if I needed to. But I think this is looking okay. We're getting our coverage. Our line's pretty straight up and down. No major hotspots. And the dose is conforming to our PTV. If our high dose lines, did not break up in between these sections of the PTV, then I would try a different collimator angle. I would add a third arc, something. You should be able to get your dose always to break up like this. All right, we're in step 3, so I'll pause. I'll let this start to level out, and you can see it's still going down. So like I keep saying, always a good idea to pause. But let's start adding some of these OARs. So I just start with EUDs. I'm going to do multiple at a time. But no harm in doing one OAR at a time. Excuse me. You can just do one at a time if that's where you're at. But the more comfortable you start to get with these plans and the more experience you get with certain sites, certain body sites, you'll be able to do this a bit faster, So that came right down. So let's keep lowering that one. Same with this one, came right down. Bone marrow obviously kind of wraps around the whole volume, so we'll try to lower it a little bit, but it probably won't go down much. But anytime you have a OAR that kind of wraps around the whole volume, like your bowel bag or something like that, generally you just got to keep an eye on your dose distribution, because you can start creating some pretty weird dose distributions by pushing on a big volume like that kind of wraps around your target. But you can see it is coming down, and so far everything looks fairly normal. Something that we really haven't done is, so if you're looking at your dose distribution, and you start to see, well, let's first try to make it happen. So let me keep pushing on these for a little bit more before I bring up what I was going to bring up. So again, in level 1, even level 2, the dose inside your target is going to look, all jaggedy. You're going to have all these holes. That's never something I worry about. It'll smooth itself out as we continue along. But your lower isotose lines, kind of the general shape of all your isotose lines and the general kind of conformality of your plant is something you should look at. And if you start to see any weird streaking or your high dose lines, so like 90, 95, 100, if any of those start to kind of streak out or become unconformal, which it's not really doing that in this plant, everything still looks pretty good. You can see this little spike starting to form. But basically, the harder we push, eventually it would start doing that. If that starts to happen, it is perfectly okay to start playing with this number too. So I only want you to play with this number if you do happen to see that streaking of those higher isotose lines. And I do it very slowly. So, if you start to see a little bit of streaking, 110. And every time you do that, you can see I only bumped it up by 10, but you get that noticeable spike, right? So you do it very slowly, bump it up by 10, see what that spike is doing. If it's improving, you can bump it up another 10, excuse me, and see if it continues to improve. If you don't see any improvement by bumping this up by 10 or 20, then just leave it alone. And that streaking, you just have to handle it with a second optimization. You can contour that streak out. You contour it, and then you use that contour in the optimizer to kind of push that dose back in. All right. Okay, so this one still pretty much came down. This one's struggling a little bit to get down. So again, once this number stays like about a 1 to 2 gray above what you're trying to push to, is when I tend to kind of maybe stop pushing on these EUDs, especially if I'm starting to lose coverage. Okay. And that's when I just kind of evaluate my plan, and I evaluate the specific constraints that I'm trying to meet. And if I'm not meeting those specific constraints, I start adding regular uppers. So let's say on our bladder, we had a constraint on 2000 centigrade that we're not quite meeting. I add my individual upper and I start pushing on that very specific area. Okay. There we go. Finally saw some movement. But again, first I kind of play with my EUDs, or maybe I'll add a couple uppers, and I just, in general, am trying to lower the dose to that OAR and get my isotose lines to shape out how I think they should look and what I think is possible. And again, I kind of use that 5 to 10 millimeters of fall off, or 5% per millimeter. 5 to 10% per millimeter of fall off. I use that rule to kind of gauge, if I'm pushing on an OAR enough, right? So step 1, just in general, get dose out of my OARs that I want to get dose out of, and then I add my uppers on those individual areas that I'm trying to meet constraints for, okay? Once I'm happy with all this, let's pretend I'm happy, which I think I am. It looks pretty good. If you scroll down here, I'm definitely, pushing dose out of the bladder, and I'm definitely pushing dose out of the rectum. Lost a little bit of coverage, but that's the goal in level 1. Level 1, you should be pushing pretty hard. You might lose a tiny bit of coverage. You might have a tiny hotspot. We're going to push play and deal with those 2 issues in level 2. Spike, pause, always a good idea to pause. You'll see tons and tons of improvement if you pause when this optimizer is falling like this. But again, for this video, just to make it go a little faster, we'll push play. Once we get to level 2, I'm going to pause. Let's let it level out just a bit. Always a good idea to look at all 3 views. Sometimes you'll notice something in a different view. All right, once it starts to kind of level out, I always do 2 things. So I'm going to add an extra lower on my targets, 97, 98%, and then, slightly over prescription. Priority of 120. CTV, we can do the same thing, or let's pretend we're really shooting for a min dose of our prescription on our CTV. Instead of adding a second lower, since we really just want the whole thing to get that dose, I can just up this number maybe and up that priority. All right, we're really trying just to get full dose to this CTV. And last but not least, you see we have this tail down here. Pretty good hotspot, right? 58, 54. It's pretty hot. 0%, 105%. High priority, 300, 400, something like that. It'll almost instantly, get rid of that hotspot. If it doesn't, if you let it start to level out and it doesn't, so like in this case, we do have this hotspot, but we added bolus. So before you start really cranking on this body, so I was going to say if it doesn't work, you just up this by another 100 and eventually it's going to work. But look at this. So our hotspot on our body is only 54, 5500. Okay. Which is still higher than we would want it to be. But our max dose is almost 6,000. But the problem with this plan is we added bolus. So this constraint is not going to work in our bolus, obviously, right? So if we scroll down here, got these hot spots in our bolus. All right, so that big hot spot, almost 6,000, is basically in our bolus somewhere. So we can't really do anything about that at the moment. But hopefully it goes away on its own. We'll see. So our PTV coverage could be a little better. It didn't improve too much. And our hotspot is right up against, it's in our bolus. I know that because this number is so much higher than this number. So it tells me we're struggling to get coverage superficially. Our PTV extends 5 millimeters outside the body. Our bolus is 10 millimeters thick, so we should have 5 millimeters of margin, right? But maybe that's not enough, or maybe we cut our bolus too short on the edges. Not positive. So we'll just let this play out and we'll just have to evaluate when it finishes, I think. So again, I would, pause at all these spikes. When it gets to level 3, I definitely pause, and that's when I evaluate my OARs. If I have a constraint that I'm not meeting, an objective that I'm not meeting, that's when I would slowly, that specific upper that I added for that specific objective or constraint, that's when I start to slowly up the priority on that. Okay, so if I'm not meeting this objective, this made up objective, I'm going to start pushing slightly harder on that, 10, 20 at a time on my priority until we are meeting it, or until I've decided that it's just impossible, right? And again, if you determine that something's impossible, there's no reason to keep working on this plan until you have a discussion with your doctor, okay? After you work with your physicians enough, a lot of times you'll kind of know what they're going to want to do. So a lot of times I do continue planning, knowing what kind of their plan B is. But if you don't know, just have that discussion before you work too hard on this plan. All right, so pretend we adjusted those, everything's happy in level 3. Now we're just letting it play through, pausing at all those spikes. So I'm going to fast forward through this until we calculate final dose here. All right, guys, that is done. It's normalized to 95% coverage. All right, so we do have a hotspot, 113. Overall, the plan's pretty hot. So 107 is our pink. We have plenty of 107. Okay, so 2 things. First, we're going to look for cold spots, okay? So our plan, in order to get this coverage, had to normalize down 2%, which isn't a good or bad thing. It just means that our plan is a little cold, right? Because it had to normalize down. So let's turn off our fields here. And look at our coverage. So as I'm scrolling through, there's some spots on the edges that are cold, and definitely superficially we're a little cold, but that is all to be expected. So let's go over kind of the 2 ways I like to deal with cold spots, which I've already shown you, but we're going to do it again. So let's convert our 100% line into a contour. Pop over to contouring. All right, we're going to take this 100% contour. I'm going to use the crop tool and take my PTV, remove parts extending inside of 100%, 0 margin. If you do that, that leaves behind all of your cold spots in your PTV. So one other additional little trick, you see we get all these little dots, right, with our cold. That's okay, especially for large volumes. That's fine. But if you're treating a really small volume, sometimes having your 100 line breakup like that, you're missing a lot of the cold spots. So what you can do is, if you convert this 100 contour, convert it into a high resolution segment, and then do it, you can see it's a little bit more accurate contour. It's going to actually be a little bit, you won't have as many of those little dots, right? You still have some because you have a lot of little spots that are cold, but this, let me do this one more time. So if we, well, I already converted it to a high resolution structure, so never mind. We just have to do it. I was going to compare the volume. So if you guys do it, measure the volume without converting it to a high resolution structure, and then convert it to high resolution structure and do it again and measure the volume. The volume as a high resolution segment will be a little bit larger because it's a little bit more accurate contour. Anyways, so that's one way. That's the easiest way to do it. Get all your cold spots, right? Something else that I do, if there's just one particular spot that's like really tricky, that just seems to always be cold, or maybe you don't care about all these little spots that are cold, there's just one area that you really need to heat up. So let's say like right here, and it's just like not doing it no matter what. You can just create a structure here in external beam planning, call it cold spot, call it whatever you want, and just manually contour it out. And a lot of times when I'm manually doing that, trying to really push dose to one specific spot that just won't listen, I over contour it. Something like that, really over contour it even outside of your PTV and really try to push dose, to that area. So you can really over contour it. And you can do the same, even if it's a little spot, like this little spot, say I really just need that covered, it's not listening, I really just over contour it like that, and then use that in the optimizer, okay? Hotspots, same thing. The easiest way to do it is to convert a line into a contour, so we can convert our 107 into a contour and use that in the optimizer. But same thing, if there's just one spot that is not listening, and a lot of times it'll be because it's in between slices. So this hotspot actually is right on a slice, but obviously our slices are 3 millimeters thick, right? So a lot of times you'll go to your global max like this, and it'll be in between slices, and it just won't go away. So what you can do is, again, just create another contour and focus on that very specific spot, and you can slightly overdo it if you need to. So we can go maybe one slice above, right on the slice, one slice below. We're going to really focus on that one spot, okay? Generally, doing it with just the isodos lines works, but if on those really tough plans, the second option is to manually find those cold spots, manually find those hot spots. Now in the optimizer, I'll do something like that. I'm just putting my standard 0% at 105% of the dose. Priority, you can do 100, 120, something fairly similar to what you got going on already with your targets. Okay, and then on the cold spots, 100, 50, 40. If it's a cold spot like on my CTV where I want the min dose to be 50, 40, I'd put 100 at 50, 100 or something like that, slightly over what I'm trying to get accomplished. All right, for my second run, I'm going to continue. I probably won't do intermediate dose again. I'll just do automatic optimization mode. And since the plan looks fairly good, we're just trying to deal with some cold spots and some hot spots. I'm only going to back it up to level 3. If I had slight if I needed to reduce doses to my OER slightly, same thing, I would just back it up to level 3 and adjust those constraints and priorities, things like that. If I needed a big change to happen, you know, maybe I'd back it up to level 2. If I'm going to back it up to level 1, I'm probably just going to start over. It's also valid to think about your collimator angles and your beams. You know, if you got all these cold spots and you run into second time with these extra contours and constraints in these cold contours, hot contours, and you just don't see much improvement, maybe we need to add that third arc. Just because it looked good in level 1 doesn't mean it's, you know, really gonna produce a good plan in the end. So you just always got to be thinking about the whole picture, right, start to finish, and what you can do to improve your plan. But it looks like that did definitely improve our coverage, improve our hotspots. So we'll let this play through again and take a second look. All right, all done. Let's normalize again. Okay, as we scroll through, let's turn these lines back on. So we have the coverage we want. Let's turn these contours off. So as we scroll through, we definitely have a lot less 107. Our hotspot is less than 110. It's a little bit hot, but less than 110. Let's see where it's at. Right here. It's probably okay, but again, you could do that again. You could create a hot contour just around that spot. You can turn your 107 back into a contour. You can do that same process with your cold and hot spots, you know, a few times. Sometimes on those really difficult plans, I'm doing it 3 or 4 times, you know, just to really get that good coverage and good homogeneity within my target, right? So if it doesn't work after 1, it should have improved a lot, but sometimes it takes a few times to get that really good, nice looking plan. So this looks pretty good, I think. It's pretty conformal. My only complaint would maybe be my CTV is a little cold, so I'd probably work on getting that CTV min dose up to 100 on this plan, okay? But otherwise, I think it looks okay. So I'm gonna create some constraints for you guys to work on based on this plan right here that we just ran together. So they will be 100% possible, and they'll be possible with just 2 arcs with this 10mm bolus, okay? So have fun with it. Let me know if you have any questions.